From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the Veterans History Project Pavilion at the World War II Memorial. We're so delighted that all of you would join us for the very first program that we're presenting here, first of many exciting programs over the next 4 days. I see a number of veterans here.
I better, put it out there. That would be the better.
So we can pay tribute to you for your valiant service. We're especially delighted to see families, young children, so they can learn the histories and help celebrate those who worked on behalf of them. The Veterans History Project, as most of you may know, is a collection at the Library of Congress of veteran stories told either recorded in audio or video form or in written memoirs, photographs, letters, and diaries. We currently have collections from over 16,000 veterans through all of the wars of the 20th century who shared their stories with us of their wartime veterans, their wartime experience. Our project is a national project that relies on grassroots volunteer help. All of those 16 stories have been collected in communities across the country through organizations or individuals who found us in some way, went to our website, downloaded the how-to guide, and conducted these interviews. They're interviews that any of you can do. You can do the interviews. Every veteran has a valuable story to tell. No matter whether he thinks he's a hero or not, it's a valuable story. We want that story in our collection to help build, so it becomes an important piece of this collection of national memory that we're collecting for future generations. I'd like now to turn the program over to Gary Ray, who's going to moderate the first panel interview with Representative Sam Gibbons, who is a very good friend of our program. He's a former member of Congress and was one of the first people who gave us his oral history. But before I do that, I'd also like to introduce to you General Don Scott. If you'll stand, General Scott. General Scott is a veteran himself and is the Deputy Librarian at the Library of Congress. We're delighted to have him with us this morning. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the only thing I ask is if you start to not be able to hear, start waving at us. We can go to different mics if we have to. So, Sam, let's start by talking about, surprise question. Why did you decide to go into a unit that jumped out of perfectly good airplanes?
I better not answer that question. I guess I wanted to be involved, and I was.
Okay. Well, let's jump ahead to the afternoon of June 5th, talk about the airfield in England, those last few hours on the ground before you actually flew across the channel.
Well, Gary, I'd like to, because that's very important, and I unfortunately remember it in great detail. We were supposed to go in on the 4th of June, but real bad weather got in the way, and it had to be delayed until the 6th of June. So we were pretty well prepared as far as loading the planes were concerned. That had been one of my jobs, and we had cross-trained with the Navy so that the Navy guns could support our parachute drop and be there with heavy long-range weapons to help us. We'd completed all of that. On the 5th of June, we began at noontime. They fed us real well, so we knew it would got to be close. They had us blacken our faces. We knew that must mean we're even closer. And after lunch, my commanding officer, Colonel Johnson, got up on a stump in our sealed-in area and made a rousing speech that I've forgotten exactly the words, but I remember the vigor that he had in it. And then we all sort of went back to our little tents and foxholes and there in Maryfield, England, and got our last adjustment to our equipment and did the things that you need to go before you go into something like that. And we talked over our plans and all of that. And as I was cleaning up my junk, I had 2 cans of beer left. I had gotten those, the Navy had given them to me for working with them on the cross training of the observers to direct their Navy fire. They actually gave me a whole case, but we were down to 2 by that time. Anyway, I said, I'm not going to leave them here. I'll stuck them in my gas mask, and I did. And I carried those 2 cans with me. I'm sure I've been court-martialed if anybody caught me, but fortunately nobody did or cared. Anyway, around 9 p.m. or 2100 hours, as we used to say, we started walking up the hill out of the little tree-covered area we'd been in and loading on our planes. There were 100 planes, 18 of us to a plane. There were a few extra planes in case any of them conked out during the warm-up period. And about 9:30 or 10 o'clock p.m., we started taking off. Long process because 1 plane at a time off the runway, and you had to circle and circle and circle until the planes could all pull together in formation. Because when we jumped, we wanted to be sure we were all together. You know, that didn't really work that way, but that's what we tried to do, to put everybody together. Anyway, finally we got in the air, and about midnight, we picked up the submarine off the coast that was to be our last checkpoint before we went in. It had a red light on its conning tower, and the pilots did that as a checkpoint. I was standing in the door because I was a jump master that night, and I saw the red flare, the red light on the top of the submarine. Anyway, not many minutes later, we began to pick up anti-aircraft fire from the islands off of the coast of France, and we came in from the western side of this big peninsula here, and we as soon as we crossed the border at Carteret, we picked up real heavy anti-aircraft fire. By that time, we had dropped down to about 800 feet because we wanted to jump low because you didn't want to swing in the air too darn long for somebody to take a pot shot at you. And so we jumped extremely low that night. Anyway, I noticed the anti-aircraft fire picked up as we penetrated more and more of the mainland France, and then I noticed that my plane began to slide off to the left. The pilot was running into fog. He was running into a lot of anti-aircraft. You could see it because there were tracers with it, and you know, we knew we had a lot more trouble than we had anticipated. So about a little after midnight, I gave the signal to go, and we went. I had taken my cue from the pilot. He switched on a green light there by the door. That meant get the heck out of this plane or I'm going to fly off and leave you somewhere. So we got out. It was an orderly exit as far as I was concerned. I pushed 2 radio operators out ahead of me and with all their equipment, and then I went out the door, and 15 other guys followed. When I hit the ground, or before I hit the ground, I noticed over to my right, about 70 yards away, were a lot of Germans shooting in the air with rifles. You could see the muzzle blast, you could see the machine gun fire and all of that, and I said, boy, I don't want to land in those guys, so I did the best I could to guide that parachute, but they don't guide very well. And I landed about 70 yards from, I think, about 15 Germans shooting it in the air. That was a blessing that they were shooting, because if they hadn't been shooting, they would have heard me, and if they hadn't been shooting, they would have seen me. But when you fire a gun at night, you get a big muzzle blast, and the soldiers on the ground who were firing at us had night blindness, and they couldn't really see us. So I landed successfully, checked everything. My legs still worked, and I had everything I was supposed to have with me. And I crawled on my belly to get away from this exposed area that I was in near those people firing. Well, finally, I found my way to the hedgerow that enclosed the field I was in. I realized that probably I was the only parachutist in that field. I won't tell you how I found that cows were in there, because crawling on my belly, I put my hand in something that warm and sticky. And I said, thank God, at least I know that the field didn't mind. If there are cows in here, there are no mines in here. Well, there are cows all over Normandy, and some of them, you know, they were great signaling devices. Anyway, that's what it was, and it took me about 40 minutes to find the first American. I used my clicker to click him up, and he used his clicker to click me back twice, so to identify himself. And after that, we started gathering up other parachutists who had dropped in the area. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I don't want to be that long on everything else, Gary.
No, you're doing fine. I'm not sure this is working either.
Can you hear us back there?
Oh, I think
Good.
they can hear you great.
All right.
I think I'm the one they're having trouble hearing, which is just right.
No.
That's the way it ought to be. They hear you, they don't hear me.
He's an old Army man, too.
Well, I was just wondering, kind of taking a step back, if you could talk for a minute about what it was like in the plane before you went out. What kind of thoughts were going through people's heads? How were the guys acting? Those kinds of things. This is the first time the 101st going into combat.
Well, I guess, you know, to be honest, I was probably pretty tense. That's another word for saying scared. But I was pretty tense, and so was everybody else. This was new. We'd heard about it. Now we were getting ready to face it. We knew about what the enemy looked like in our area. They outnumbered us badly. Our intelligence said there were at least 90,000 Germans where we were jumping. And, you know, you feel pretty lonesome when they tell you there are 90,000 people out there to greet you, and you're just a single person. Jumping has a peculiar effect out of an airplane. I imagine some of you all have jumped. Maybe there's some parachutists out there. But because the plane is going pretty fast, when you jump out of an airplane, you spread out a pretty good distance. And so you're kind of alone to begin with. And being alone at night is doubly anxiety building. And when you know you're probably in the wrong place because the plane is veered to the left too much, you know that you got troubles ahead of you. So coming across the ocean, I had many thoughts. I remember one particular. I remember that I was thinking about an old girlfriend of mine and what she was doing that night. And so, you know, a lot of things went on in your mind. But it was a beautiful moonlight night. The ocean spread out there, nice and silvery. It didn't look rough from up where we were, but the people in the landing craft said it was, you know, pretty damn rough.
Okay, so the other thing I think it'd be important to talk about is, you know, we're young men when we go to combat. We're kind of young, we're dumb, we're immortal. We think that this is going to be just another experience, and then something usually happens in the first few minutes to dissuade us of that idea. We understand that this can be dangerous. Could you describe that for us?
Well, I think being young and dumb is an advantage because your anxiety doesn't build as high. You know, we found that true when we went into Holland. We were having a lot more anxiety in ourselves and in our troops than we were when we went into Normandy. So, you know, being young and dumb and full of vigor and well-trained and, you know, I wouldn't say cocky, but some of us were. And, you know, it helped. It helped to get us there. None of us thought we were going to die. You know, some never even knew they died. I'm a survivor.
Well, now up on that.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
One last question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
All right.
Up there on that map, it looks so so clean and pretty. All of the patches are right there together, and the drop zones are right there. Let's talk a little bit about how tough it was to get your units together.
All right, let me, I don't know how many of you can see this map. Can you see it back there? Okay. Well, up, not on this map, up here is England. And this is a peninsula that sticks out into the Atlantic Ocean. And this is France's biggest port up here. This was our objective. We had to have a port and have it quickly and put it in operation, because we could never have landed enough men and equipment across these beaches to support the kind of effort that it took to break out of this pocket that we were in. So England's up here. We flew from that direction. We came in across this post, and I was supposed to drop down in here. This is my unit in here. I actually dropped way over here. It doesn't look like much on this map, but you know, it was a long walk. There were lots of unfriendly folk in between, and it took quite some time to actually catch up with my unit. But we had 2 missions that day, and before I talk about the mission, let me show you the troops that we had up here. This is General Montgomery. He was the overall commander of the invasion. Now, some of you are going to say, well, why did we Americans have a British general? Well, he was the most combat experienced general of the time. He was a good commander. He knew what the heck he was doing, and he knew how to give the orders. So he was the overall commander. And over here was General Bradley. He commanded all the Army U.S. forces. And over here is General Dempsey, and he commanded all the British forces in the invasion, direct command. Now, this is a British beach. This is a Canadian beach. This is a British beach. This is bloody Omaha. This is where we lost more people in D-Day than any other place. And this is Utah Beach. Now, I said Cherbourg was our objective. We had to get Cherbourg and get it quick and put it into operation as quickly as we could, or you just couldn't bring in the logistics support or the manpower support that you needed to get out of this invasion situation. So, really the main effort was right here. These efforts were holding efforts. That doesn't mean that any less killed. In fact, more were killed right here than any one spot. But they were only supposed to drive in far enough so that the beaches here would be out of German artillery range and out of rifle fire, machine gun fire, of course. And we had a job, a twofold job. The 101st Airborne Division was tasked for 2 purposes that night. We had dropped on top of the Germans. We had to move up to this beach and open these beaches from the rear. That's because there was a barrier behind the beaches that caused the soldiers to have to cross some narrow causeways, and they would just been sitting ducks for the German defenders of those causeways. And so our job was to catch those causeways from the rear, open up as many of these gun emplacements along here from the rear, and get the heck out of there before the Air Force bombed the hell out of it and before the Navy shot the hell out of it. So that was our job on the beach. We also had to secure this river line, which shows on this map. Now, the river line is much broader in actuality than this blue line. That river that night was about a mile wide, and is anything from a few inches deep to over your head deep. And that was to be our defensive line to keep the Germans from moving all of the reinforcements they had down here, their tank divisions and everything else, into the battle area. This river was very, very important, and it was controlled by bridges, and the depth of it was controlled by a dike down here, a dam, whatever you call it, you know, something to hold the river back and spread it out. And so the Germans had used that as one of their defenses, and we wanted to use it as our defense, that broad river line, to keep the Germans from sending in reinforcements real quick. That we did. We didn't do it according to our plan, but it worked. And I think it worked because everybody knew what the objective was, and if they dropped in the wrong place, they moved to try to do what was nearest to them. And so, in confusion, we opened up this beach right here, this one with these 2 arrows on it, and sort of opened up this beach. We were able to seize the river line and the locks on the river line to control the depth of the river within about 2 hours after we hit the ground. I didn't do it. I was dropped way up here. It doesn't look like much on that map, but it took me about 2.5 days to get down to where my regular unit was. And having been dropped away from the drop zones down here that were laid out, I probably was blessed. You know, I didn't feel blessed in the beginning because I was out there on my own, but the Germans had defended this area with the 6th German Parachute Regiment. Now, the German Parachute Regiment was one that had been really bloodied in World War II. They were experienced soldiers, they knew what the heck they were doing, and they fought like tigers. They defended this area in here, and they had picked out the places most likely for parachute drops and really heavily defended those. So the problems that we had on landing were really compounded. You're scattered, you're dark, you know, you're all mixed up with the Germans, and they're mixed up with you, and you had identity problems, you had organizational problems of trying to get your unit together and get it to do its mission. All those things we had, and that's the picture that we came to daylight with. We had a lieutenant colonel killed before he could get out of his harness. We had lots of captains and lieutenants, and God knows how many soldiers we had that never really made it into the battle area. They paid the price, but we got the job done anyhow. So that's D-Day as I see it. My own particular role was to try to find enough people up in this little isolated area to put together a combat patrol and to get down here and attack this town of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, which was right on the river line. And it took me about an hour and a half to get enough people together to do anything constructive. We hit the highway, came down the highway, ran into Saint-Côme-du-Mont, and ran into a perfect German ambush. They just shot the hell out of us. And, but we escaped from that ambush, were able to set up a defense on the road, and kept the Germans from moving up and down this road that connected Saint-Côme-du-Mont or the river line with Saint-Miraglisse. So that's my story of that. I want to tell you soldiers out there, you World War II soldiers, please, if you haven't told your story, tell it, write it. Go to the Veterans History Project and say, I got something I want to talk about. They want to hear from you. They'll preserve your records in the Library of Congress, which is probably the oldest institution in the United States. Not as old as the Army, but it's an old institution. And they will present it to your heirs, to everybody else that's inquisitive about what happened in World War II. Tell your story, because maybe some future leader will read it and understand that war ain't fun, that war is tough, that lots of people get killed, and you got to think carefully before you get engaged in anything like that. I know you've got those stories in you. I know you've got those stories in you, and they're important that they be preserved. You never can tell what you say may influence history in the future. Thank you so much for being here and for enjoying this day. See you at the dedication. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.